You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. I want to welcome Mark Morris. He's a dad, a running enthusiast, a coffee snob, a flexible working advocate based on the Gold Coast in Australia, and it is afternoon in Australia. Hello, Mark, and how are you?
Hello, Lisa. I'm well. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great, and it's great to have you on the podcast. So, being a dad with a special interest in your children's schooling, I'm really curious about why you pulled out your son out of a prestigious Gold Coast private school. What happened?
Yes, well, it's a long story, but in short, it's because despite our best efforts, the school, AB Patterson College on the Gold Coast here in Australia, didn't prioritise gender equality, basically, which is very important to us as a family. And so, it's important that the school we send our children to also supports and enables gender equality through its actions and policies. So I think we were naive, looking back. We didn't look below the surface. We believed the lie that private schools are better. We got pulled in, by words like elite and prestigious. And in a way, now I'm a bit ashamed that we did, because, what I've come to realize is that these adjectives, along with, terms like traditional values, are often, masking underlying principles of prejudice, like, sexism and racism. So it's been a journey, and my son, who is still 4 and almost 5, was due to commence his first school at AB Patterson this year in January. Mm-hmm. Which in Australia, the first year of school is called prep, and it's considered by many families to be a joyous milestone and rite of passage in a child's life. And over his life so far, he's grown his hair, and he now wears it in, what we call a man bun. And, we tried cutting it shorter one year, and he didn't really like it. And so long hair has become a bit of his identity, a bit of his personality. And he's a lovely, kind-hearted boy. And, of course I'm biased, but, we never committed to the long hair. But when faced with the prospect of the school's kind of short back and sides hair policy for boys, we wrote a proposal to the school to update their hair policy in the spirit of gender equality. And we thought that at some point he may want to cut his hair short, and we would support him either way. But we felt that, it's his body, and he should have a right to choose as an expression of himself, And so that started a long process, which took months. But ultimately, the school rejected the proposal with very little reason why. And we only found out the day before school was supposed to start this year. So we had a big decision to make. Either we pulled the kids out of school, or we held my son down, and forcibly cut his hair against his will, which seemed abusive and barbaric. So, we pulled them out. And a lot of what I do, at home and at work is inspired, by my family and, just trying to create a better future for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, Australia has, of course, this, it's very common for children, private schools are, if you like, part of the Australian culture, the country, whereas if we compare that to Sweden, we have a few private schools, but it's causing a whole lot of, if you like, angst, and there are a lot of people against it. And so it's really interesting to hear from a parent in Australia actually saying that, you were basically taken in by the actual like you said, the adjectives, the eliteness, or it. I don't know, but I know it also would have caused some discussion, even if if the decision went against your family. It would have caused some discussion where there are those who would be for the private schools. What do you call dress code, behavior codes, all of this. Do you think that is a wrong thing then, or?
Look, I mean, there is always going to be different opinions on any topic, and but I think what has irked me about this process is that it's not the freedom of choice has been removed. So I completely support, parents and families who choose to, dress a certain way, or have their hair cut a certain way, or believe in a certain, religion, because that's their freedom of choice. And I believe that, I thought that, Australia was a very inclusive country, whereby we supported, whatever other people wanted to do, as long as they weren't hurting anyone or forcing it on other people. And this whole experience has really opened my eyes a little bit in terms of, especially with the private schools, that it's not inclusive, it's not tolerant at all, that you have to fit a certain, type, you have to fit certain criteria. And if you don't meet those criteria, then you're suddenly, not welcome.
Did you go to a private school yourself, or were you educated in the public system?
I experienced both types of schools through my schooling, and that's a while ago now. So I've been out of school for more than 20 years. And, so I experienced public and private, and I also experienced single-sex schools and co-ed schools. And so, I had that experience, but I thought, as I said naively, that so much time has passed and society has evolved and societal expectations have evolved. And I thought we had moved past that, especially with in Australia, there's been so much discussion and effort in the gender equality space. I thought that, schools would, of course, agree that gender equality is a good thing, that we should be supporting and enabling freedom of choice. But I was wrong.
And it's interesting when you say, yes, it was like 20 years ago you were in the school, part of schooling in Australia. And then when you have children, you would imagine that, of course, things would change and go ahead, go with the times, if you like. It would be more inclusive, more open. And then you find, to your, surprise, that, hey, it's not at all as I thought it would be. So what was your decision? Where's your kids now? What are they doing? Are they in public school, or what did you decide?
Yeah, no, look, the kids are great now. My son is doing really well, and so he's almost 5, and my daughter's 8, and I've just got the 2, and they're both well and happy. And because it happened so quickly, and we didn't plan on it happening, we've been homeschooling them in the short term, and we didn't want to rush jumping into starting in another school. So we kind of, took a breath to think about what we wanted to do next. And so we've been homeschooling them and juggling work from home as well. But he's doing so well with all of his homeschool content, and the kids are happy and well rested every day, and they play really well together. And I'm teaching him French and piano, and he loves football and swimming. And we're looking at other schools now, but if we send them back to a mainstream school, it would definitely be a public school after what we've learned about private schools.
And, there are a lot of people who would be supporting you, and they were going, yay, someone has seen the light.
Yeah. And look, I've had those types of responses,
yes.
and
yes.
because I've been sharing a bit of my story on LinkedIn, and I've had a lot of people like yourself, reach out, and one lady, I think she did it with tough love, but she said, I've been fighting this fight for 30 years, so welcome to the club. So I think this fight of prejudice in private schools isn't new. It's just that I didn't realize.
And on top of it, you're actually paying for it.
That's right. Yeah,
And
it's really interesting that we pay for we pay for the privilege to prejudice, in a way.
absolutely, absolutely. If you are an owner of a private school, you particularly, you decide to have a school in Sweden, the money that you get in are assured because it's directly from taxpayers' purses.
Mm,
And I'm not for that at all.
yeah.
And so, and that's obviously have got to do with culture. But anyway, but look, I'm really happy that your kids are happy, and even if it's about struggling, the home life, the good thing is that you can do that in Australia.
Yeah.
In Sweden, you are obligated. If you don't send your kids to school, parents will be fined.
Okay.
But we don't have, if you like, a dress code. There is not, there's very much this talk about that, children, about their own self-identity, even at very early ages. But the formal age where children start, if you like, the so-called first year is when they are 6. It used to be 7. And so I was brought up here in Sweden, and my mother, absolutely no way I was going to go to any kindy. There were 5 of us. You play with each other's and you learn the social norms, how to get along. But anyway, so, countries have got different ways, but that was one thing. But whereas my son went to kindergarten already when he was 8 months old, and that was in Australia, that wouldn't happen in Sweden because of the parental leave that is provided both for both parents. So you would actually get paid for being at home, with your children. So
yeah, and that's lovely, and that's something else. Sorry, you go.
Yeah. No. That's so there are a little bit differences. So when I hear you say, they're happy, you are enjoying. It sounds like you are actually enjoying also being at home.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So now you work as an associate director at Barclay Consulting. So can you talk a little bit about what you do? Now you can work from home, I assume.
Yeah. So, I, as you mentioned, I'm an associate director at Barclay Consulting. So, I work with a small team. There's only 4 of us, so beautiful people, and we're strategy consultants. So, we work with businesses to ultimately help them perform better in some way. We try to help them get on a path for sustainable success.
Right.
We're advisors and problem solvers. We're analysts. I'm an executive and leadership coach, and we like to help people. And we all feel very strongly about equity, including gender equity. And my work also touches on, the areas I've mentioned, but tends to focus on people-related work like human resources, leadership, high-performing teams, diversity, equity, inclusion, values, strategy, things like that. And I work from home mostly, which is great. And we've started incorporating research into our work too, which I'm really enjoying. And so we're familiar going into workplaces to make them more equitable, and we're hoping to do the same thing with schools, which are very complex, or complex organisations.
Yes. Now I know that you have. You did an interesting study titled The Gold Coast Schoolyard, A Crossroads of Gender Equity. So can you talk about the reason for the study and some of the findings that you came up with?
Yeah, sure. So, in 2023, last year, there was a lot of media attention around gender-based violence here in Australia, sadly. And, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency also started reporting on gender pay gap data, which shows at a high level how much men earn in relation to women. And so, the smaller the gap, the more equitable. And, so there was a lot of discussion around the drivers behind these issues, and gender equality was recognised as one of the contributing factors. So for example, if men earn all the money, it sustains holding power over women and using that in domestic abuse and coercive control situations. So, women earning more gives more power and more independence, very crudely. But, and there are academics and advocacy groups, driving gender equality for many reasons, including that if people see each other as equals, that they're less likely to resort to violence. So as analysts and problem solvers, we were discussing these issues as a team one day and started thinking about the root cause. So where does it start? Where does it start? Because kids aren't born violent, and so the early years of childhood are a critical phase for neurodevelopment, and in Australia 99% of kids will attend a mainstream school, so schools can either choose to be a part of the solution or not. And with a lot of the discussion around gender equality focused on the workplace, we wondered how gender equitable are schools. And so, my personal experience gave me some insight into one school, but we didn't want to assume that that was representative of all schools without, gathering some evidence and data. So we embarked on a study to look at gender equity in the 114 schools in our Gold Coast region. And to do this, we partnered with some professors at local universities to develop criteria to assess the schools against. And then we analysed the school's policies and website content systematically across every school. And the criteria included things like dress and appearance standards, access to activities, and, we even looked at sporting uniforms, which in many instances are more fitted and revealing for girls. And so, Dr. Rachel Jefferson in Australia has done some great research in this space around the objectification and sexualisation of girls in sport. And so, we worked with the local professors to draw insights from the data and publish a report. Some of the major insights showed that public schools, so the ones that are free and government run, were significantly more equitable than private schools, and that the schools that were considered the most elite were the most likely to have strict gender stereotypes in their policies. So, with around 40% of schools in Australia being private, and with Australia committed to our national strategy to achieve gender equality, we're confused now as to why private schools are left to sustain inequality, but the rest of Australia is trying to push for equality. So it seems a bit counterproductive.
When you talk about the schools, this included also the single-sex schools. So they differed in being more about inequality?
Yeah, look, I mean, in our cohort of schools, so there were 114, and on the Gold Coast there are only 4 single-sex schools, and there were 3 male schools and 1 female school. And so because the number was so small, it was hard to draw kind of inferences. But we did note that, as you said, those schools by default have very gender discriminatory rules because they're only focused on one gender. So, in a way, we sympathised with single-sex schools because it's very hard for them to promote gender equality when they're only focused on one gender by principle. But there still are things that single-sex schools could do that they're not doing. For example, if it was a girls' school, they could allow the girls to wear trousers or shorts. If it was a boys' school, they could allow the boys to have their hair long. They could offer sports in the boys' school like dancing and netball. They could offer sports in the girls' school like rugby. And so there are definite ways to be more equitable. But I think they're always going to be less equitable.
And that has also got to do with the tradition of each school.
Absolutely. And the oldest schools are often the ones who are holding on to these outdated stereotypes, but they're the stereotypes that were in place when the schools were founded. So these rules were perfectly reasonable in the late 1800s when the schools were founded, but they haven't updated them. So it's a bit odd. It's like, are we preparing the kids for the world of tomorrow, or are we preparing kids for the world of yesterday? Yeah.
So what kind of, I suppose, what kind of attention have you received from the study? Have you sent it to the schools? Have you heard anything back from the schools, or has there been any media attention to the study?
Yeah, look, really, really interesting question. So the study has now been shared globally. So I've been reached out to and spoken with people in the UK and Europe and yourself, in Canada and the US and New Zealand and in Asia as well. And I've spoken to a whole range of experts and professors like yourself who are really interested in this. As an insight into the Australian schooling system, but also as a cultural comparative. And so it's given me a lot of insight into, globally what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've also received some local interest media. So I've been, had a couple of little TV spots and a couple
Yeah,
of newspaper
yeah.
spots and things like that. And I'm still, I'm still fighting because I think that so far the media has focused on, the trees, and I'm looking for a journalist now and talking to a few journalists to focus on the forest, because there are bigger issues than just letting boys have long hair. There are systematic inequalities similar to the ones you were talking about, in
Yes.
terms of funding and governance, that really need to be addressed.
Mm.
But yeah, so still working with potential media,
Mm.
but then also, I'm getting a lot of contact from people who just want to get involved. So, I'm not sure what the next steps will be, but there will probably be some further research. People are starting to ask me if they can contribute money, and I'm not prepared for that. So I'm looking into, what that would involve.
Mm.
But, that might involve, becoming some kind of um, not-for-profit organization that focuses on equity for kids or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. What do you as a parent want to see happening in schools? I mean, just think about maybe three things that you'd like to see implemented now.
Schools should be institutions that help to prepare kids for the world that they'll move into after finishing school. So, I think that the rules in schools should be reflective of the rules in broader society and the rules in workplaces. And where private schools at the moment, there's a completely different rule set that exists in these schools that wouldn't exist anywhere else in society, and in fact would be deemed, illegal in some instances, to be discriminatory in such a way. So I think that the rules in schools need to align, and what that would involve, though, is, potentially some legislation updates, in Australia to force schools to be compliant. But any school could, if they chose to, enable and support equity and equality, they could update their policies right now. They could say, we're going to let boys have long hair. We're going to let girls, wear shorts and trousers if they want to. We're not going to force them, but they can if they want to. And so I think it also opens up more inclusion for LGBTQI youth and transgender and non-binary youth, because at the moment these kids who fall into minority groups are kept on the outside, and then they're victimized and attacked because of it. So I think a very simple thing would be for schools to update their policies and practices for gender equity. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing would be to build gender equity into the school curriculum, and build it into teaching practices and discussions, with kids of every age at age appropriate levels. For example, um, for kids in kindergarten, you wouldn't necessarily have a boys' corner and a girls' corner. You wouldn't give all the boys trucks and you wouldn't give all the girls dolls. So I think that those practices all the way through a school and like a whole of school approach
Mm.
would really go a long way to help break down stereotypes.
Yep.
And I think that, I mean, there's a lot I could probably say, but the other one I think is a really big one is I think schools need to get more dads involved. When you look around schools in Australia, at least, A recent study estimated that 80% of unpaid work in relation to schooling is done by mothers and women. But, why? Like, kids can't be what they can't see. So if all they see is, mum or auntie or,
Yep.
someone
Yep.
doing all of that, the drop-offs and the pickups and the volunteering and the tuck shop and they only see women doing that, then that's what they start to build their world upon. They start to build their world upon, women doing all of that unpaid work and men off, doing other work or earning money or being less involved with the family. And I think schools could proactively encourage dads to get involved and get dads involved in things like school committees, school volunteering, reading groups in classes, dedicated drop off or pick up days for dads. And I think it would be uncomfortable for a while because it would require some behaviour change, but it would go a long way to having a more balanced and equitable society.
So do you think dads in Australia would be prepared to jump on board an initiative like that by schools?
I think it's a good time now. I feel like there's a lot of really good energy around fatherhood and positive masculinity in Australia. Like there's a lot of it's very topical. There's a lot of groups kind of looking at it and trying to encourage it. I think that there's a lot of legislation being changed, similar to what you were describing, in Sweden, where all parents are encouraged to have time off, and whereas that's fairly new in Australia, especially for dads, to get paid time off when their kids are born. So I think all of that is becoming a bit more equitable, and as a result, I think it's a really good time to have these conversations where schools could say, we care about gender equity and here's what we're going to do about it. And we want you to care about it too, because it ultimately benefits the kids.
I'm just thinking about the possibility for gender equality when there has not been any decrease in violence against women and children in Australia.
No, absolutely. It's really concerning. But I have to stay positive and hopeful, and if we look back at how far we've come, I do feel like things are moving in the right direction toward gender equality, and I feel like it's helping, but it's going very slow. And so we definitely need a lot more efforts involved. A recent study predicted that it would take 130 years on our current trend to achieve gender equality, and that's just too long. So I think we need to increase our efforts, and that means in workplaces, in the home, and in schools, we need to prioritise gender equality and be prepared to make some difficult changes if it takes us, in the right direction. But, when we're talking about violence toward women and children, gender equality is only one contributing factor, and it's a very complex problem that's multifaceted. So we need to look at how we're raising boys into men, because as I mentioned earlier, boys aren't born violent. So we as a society are making them that way, either in the home or in broader societal influences. So, there are some great academics and advocates playing in this space in Australia already, like Michael Flood and Colleen McKinnon, and in the UK, there's a gender action group with Angharad Morgan. But, sexist influences could be the toys we buy for kids, or, do the toys we buy for our boys invoke fighting or violence? Do we, do the books we read to them, what are the male role models doing in those books? The TV shows that they watch, in those shows, do they, convey that the way to resolve conflict is through violence? And so then if we look at the root cause, we need to look at books and media as they're being produced, now, and hopefully new regulations come in place for this that restrict violence and sexism, and also how we tolerate and shape behaviour. The whole, boys will be boys attitude to behaviour really needs to stop. And, it's not just about violence, but it's about superiority and the prevalence of a patriarchal society,
Exactly.
and so we really need to look at how we're raising boys, and then tackling it at every stage of the process. So yes, we need to deal with the adults now who are suffering, who are victims, and the ones who are likely to be victims and at risk, and perpetrators and all of that, and consequences. Absolutely. But I think we also need to look at the pipeline of violence, coming through, and we need to go, okay, well, let's target young kids, let's target kids at school, let's target teenagers, and let's try to cut the violence off at every step of the way. And then, that feeds into the whole healthy masculinity, topic, where, we need to redefine what masculinity looks like. And, I think we need to move away from what it used to look like. And there are some great people doing work in this space, like, Michael Ray in Australia and Jake Steker in Canada. And I think it's multifaceted,
Yes,
so I think
yes.
that there's a lot of things we need to do. Gender equality is part of it, but I think it's ultimately about good role models, looking at the other influences in society, and helping boys grow into kind, caring, gentle men.
There is, of course, the issue that is really huge across the world, and that's got to do with the influence of social media, smartphones, and all. We have some bizarre leaders in our world, and their impact on kids, because when kids reach a certain age, they're very good at hiding things even from parents.
Yeah, look, I personally think smartphones are incredibly harmful. And where kids are concerned, I believe that they do more harm than good. I think access to harmful content is made far too easy. And even with security restrictions in place, and with social media evolving, the ability for kids to send each other content. So even if a kid's not on a platform, they could receive content from another kid, and it's almost impossible to protect them. And so, I'm currently reading Generation Anxiety by Jonathan Haidt, which centers on this topic, and I'd highly recommend it to any listeners. Predators, scams, and a recent study revealed that kids as young as 9 are being exposed to pornography, which is a huge problem because
Disgusting.
not just because of its sexual content, but because of the nature of most pornography is abusive and degrading to women. So then in their minds, that's what normalizes, and so-called influencers like Andrew Tate are so dangerous to young boys and girls, but, young impressionable minds via social media. But even peer bullying via smart devices is made easier. Last year, one of the other kids in my daughter's grade 2 class got a smartphone for her 8th birthday, which I personally completely disagree with, but, it's up to, families to make their decisions, obviously. But, they've been proven to have a negative impact on mental health, social skills, and even physiology, with kids having neck and wrist issues.
Yes.
So, I suppose despite my passion for innovation and progress, I think society's at a dangerous place with regard to smart devices. I'd like to see a course correction away from kids having access to smartphones in the first place. But it's probably unlikely. And I think the best protection at the moment seems to be education, educating parents, educating kids, and simultaneously addressing things like pornography, social media, making sure there are harsh penalties for digital bullying, which in some instances has led to youth suicide, but also prioritising, respectful relationships and communication skills from an early age. As a father of an 8 and 5-year-old, I'm scared of where technology is going in the next 5 to 10 years, and I just hope I can, keep my kids from harm while also teaching them to be critical and discerning about what they see.
And so, of course, the schools have got a massive role in this.
Absolutely. And as I've said with some of the other, comments, I think schools can either choose to be passive and say it's not our problem, or they can choose to be a part of the solution, because the problems are there, whether the schools acknowledge them or not. And they've got a captive audience of 99% of children. So I think, we really need to be asking what we prioritize in schools. Is it more important that we develop, kind, gentle, humans that go into the world and become, kind, gentle leaders, or is it more important that they get 100% on a maths test? So I think, not saying that maths isn't important, but I think we do need to look at, our priorities in schools.
Mm. Especially since kids spend so many hours of their day in the school. So, what is it in Australia? Still from 9 to 3 p.m. And then what they do, maybe beforehand, or if they do after school activities. And then, of course, they are tutored, or, I don't know. I mean, but I imagine the stressful life our kids have. And I'm absolutely with you. Schools need to rethink how things are done. And perhaps it's also a responsibility. I mean, here in Sweden, it's very much talk about that. It is the school's responsibility to socialize kids to what kind of citizens we want them to become. We have massive issues with social media, like I would imagine Australia have. We have issues not only with the current war that is happening on our doorstep, and then we got the climate change, and we got the technology. So things are happening in a real, if you like, in a very fast. Perhaps we are just moving a bit too fast, and maybe we need to take a step back and take a deep breath. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who would say, we don't have time for that because, the next generative AI is happening as we speak. There are, and so I can also imagine the anxiety and the concern parents have, having young kids. And that's why it's even more important to have a voice like yours.
Yeah, thank you. No, look, I mean, I didn't plan on becoming an activist, but I suppose, what I've learned in the last 12 months of research and talking to people has just concerned me so much that I can't not act. Like, I can't just sit back and be a passive bystander. I have to try and, have a positive impact, because ultimately, not only will it help my kids, but it'll help all kids. I think that is one of our primary goals, or maybe should be as adults, is to create a better world for the next generation coming through. And I think in some ways we've made more problems, and I think we're at a tipping point where we need to start shifting it back in the other direction. And, some of the issues that you mentioned, I wonder if people are at, trauma fatigue, because of social media and exposure to these terrible things that are happening around the world. It's almost like something else terrible happens and people just kind of shrug it off. Oh yeah, well, it's just another terrible thing, because we're aware of everything now. And so when something terrible does happen, even if it's significant, it doesn't impact us, because we just kind of were in our little world, and we can filter it out.
We become a bit immune towards it.
Yeah. We've seen, we're seeing at the moment a bit of a shift in terms of people's attitudes towards mainstream schools in Australia, because it's not mandatory that there's a homeschooling option for people in Australia, and there's also more companies starting up, with alternative schooling options. And so, the growth of homeschooling and alternative schooling in Australia has grown 200% in the last 12 months. And I think that that's, representative of people's, just impatience with the sector's evolution. It's outdated in so many ways, and it's built around a society that no longer exists.
Mm-hmm. Mark, is there anything that comes to your mind that you think it's really important to mention that we haven't brought up, or I haven't kind of brought up to talk about?
Yeah, look, thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I think probably one of the most alarming things that I've learned in the last 12 to 18 months of research is that in Australia, or at least in Queensland, and there is some slight difference across all states, but I believe it's consistent in the sense that the Human Rights Act does not apply to children in private school settings. So private schools are exempt from the rights that are afforded to children under the Human Rights Act, which when I first learned that, I didn't believe it. I thought that's ridiculous. How could that possibly be true? But it's been validated multiple times by experts, and it is true. And I don't think every single parent that I've spoken to in the last 12 months didn't realize it. And I don't think that it's talked about enough. And I don't understand why or how it came to be that children that go to private schools, when parents send their children to a private school, they're doing so believing that it's better in some way, but in fact, they're actually signing over their child's rights under the Human Rights Act, which includes things like freedom of expression and things like that. So this is why private schools have the ability to be so controlling, is because they're not subject to the same regulations as public schools are. And I think that that's wrong, and I think it's unethical. And so, that's definitely something that I'd like people to know, and hopefully we can try and change that.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'm excited about. I welcome any contact or questions that any of the listeners might have, and I would absolutely be happy to talk to you again if that comes up as an option, and wish you all the best. And I'd love to come over and visit. It's on my wish list, and my wife and I have both spoken about actually working overseas at some point in our lives. So I would absolutely love to come to Sweden.
And you are welcome. And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.